Hello and welcome to episode 47, and instead of talking about sound, today we're going to talk about lighting. In the background you might notice a fair bit of noise today. That's because I'm surrounded by moving lights and the things have all got fans in and they make quite a bit of row. One of the things you'll soon learn about LED lights is that long life is difficult if they overheat. So most of them nowadays have got decent fans in which at least keep the internal temperatures a bit lower. Now, if you're considering either static or moving head LED equipment, maybe you've got a band or maybe you've got a small theatre or some events, you can choose to spend an awful lot of money on a few expensive tag items like the Martins, the clay packies, the Robbies. All of those are expensive lights. Most of the Chinese ones, especially the Chinese ones that you buy on Aliexpress, appear to be much cheaper. So I thought I'd talk about the pros and cons of buying lights from China similar to these. One of the first things you need to understand properly is how buying lights on AliExpress actually works. You might think you're buying from a fairly big firm, but if you buy on AliExpress and you buy LED equipment like this, what you're actually doing is buying from quite small little businesses, usually 1, 2, 3 people or so. They actually have a couple of rooms in a big complex. So typically they'll have an office and they'll have a small workshop. Some will have bigger ones, some will have smaller ones, but the idea is that you have a small work area within a much larger building. And what you cannot do with Chinese lighting is look at a picture and think that you've seen that somewhere else. What you've probably seen is the box. It's a bit difficult to wrap your head around this one. But the typical way that moving head lights, LED lights, effects lights, all of those are made is that somebody has a room in one of these complexes. The complex is also full of all sorts of other businesses. So somebody will be doing plastic injection moulding and they'll make cases for lights. They don't make anything other than just the boxes. Somebody else will make power supplies. Somebody else will make PCBs with the programming on. Somebody else might make the displays that go on the front. There'll be another company who probably specialise in the servo motors and the optics parts of these things. And somebody will sit in their office and have a great idea for a light. We want it to be red, green, blue and white. We might want to have lenses that can do zoom. And we want it to be bright and we want it to be cheap. And then they'll put together a shopping list, go around all these other places and source all the parts. So you might have a common housing, but the thing that's inside it will be very different. This has got definite advantages and some pretty major disadvantages. What it means is, if you need 10 of something, you need to buy them in one go. And preferably, if you need 10, buy 12. You can either then choose to use those other 2 as spares, stick them in a storeroom somewhere, bring them out if any of the others die. Or, as I tend to do, if I need 10, I'll buy 12 and then I use 12. And if anything dies, I just go back down to 11 and then back down to 10. What you don't want to do is buy a small number like 2 to see how a product works, because unless you order it from the same supplier within maybe 2 or 3 weeks, the ones that come later may not match. What will actually happen is that the LED batches that they were being built from will run out and they'll be replenished. So what this means is that the red colour might be different 4 weeks later. So you get a different batch of red LEDs, and when you put all of your lights on red, you can see that 6 are one colour, 6 are another colour. So you need to buy these things in one go. I've had probably 50-50 success adding lights more than 6 months later. Very often it's not just the colour of the LEDs that change either. Programming changes. The actual chips inside on the board, the DMX layout. So if we have perhaps DMX channel 1 is doing pan, DMX channel 2 is doing tilt. DMX channel 3 in a later version of the same light might do some new feature that you haven't actually expected. I've got some wash lights like the one behind me, and I bought them a year apart, and the second batch do extra things. They're not actually extra things that I really need, because most of them are effects, and I don't tend to use those too much. I do them in the lighting control, but it does mean that I've actually got a wash light that is the original series, and I've got a completely different wash light programming for ones that do pretty much the same thing and certainly look the same. So it gets a bit confusing when you start to add lights. So wherever you can, buy them together. Now, it also means that in a year's time, if you want to have, say, a new power supply, well, you can order one, but when it comes, it might be different. Same sort of thing has happened to me. So I order a new power supply for one of the lights because it's died. The first one I had 3 terminals, 1 common and 2 with volts on. The new one had 4. It was actually 2 separate power supplies in one box. And to make it more reliable, the idea was that you would run the electronics off one section of the power supply, and you would run the actual LED drivers from the other one. So you're actually sharing the load between 2 power supplies in one box. Well, my lights, the lighting harness didn't cater for that at all. I'd actually got a shared power supply. I discovered in the end that in actual fact that it was a common rail that was shared, and I could actually join the 2 things together, and I was back to where I was. But initially, instead of having 3 terminals, I got 4. That's a very common thing. If you order anything in the optics line, you can't always guarantee that the angle of the lenses that you get sent later on are going to match the ones you had earlier, because they've come from a different supplier in the same building. So working with all these little specialists in one big, huge building gives you some great advantages. You can actually get really amazing lights if you look very carefully and read the specs. Now you have to read the specs very carefully because most of these people don't speak English. So the actual wording in their adverts has come from probably Google Translate or whatever the Chinese version of that is. And very often it confuses. So you need to ask questions. If you're not quite sure if that special feature you need is in this light, ask them. They're usually quite honest, and they'll say yes it does it or no it doesn't do it, and that's always a good way to work. But you are working with people in a foreign country who probably don't speak English, so there can be mistakes made. What other things happen? Shipping can be a slight snag. If you buy half a dozen, it's possible that one of them will end up with a crack in it by the time it gets to you. I've discovered that certain shaped lights, and again, these wash lights, the red one behind me, that style of case has now been available for about 12 years, and it doesn't travel too well. The plastic is slightly rubbery to the feel. It's a different texture to most plastics, and I think if they get dropped, the stress from the screws in the case that are stretching that case quite tight is a bit too much, and they crack. So I got them to send me a few spares, and whenever I break one, I think I've still got 3 or 4 left over, and I can just put a new case on. It actually comes in 2 halves, so one half goes one side, one half goes on the other side, and they're screwed together, and it's okay. But I think that's not really a manufacturing problem. It's just part of the fact that it's coming thousands of miles, and they're going to get bumped about a bit. Now, having said that, these things have actually been pretty reliable. Common faults. red LEDs. You don't tend to get too much grief with the blue ones, or the green ones, or the white ones. But you do find that the red ones seem to draw a little bit more current, and it's quite common in some of these to discover that you suddenly lose half of the red LEDs, everything else works. That usually means that you then run the remaining red ones at full power instead of being dimmed, and then they go as well. So I've got, I think out of 30 odd that we've got up in the air, there's probably now a good 6 or 7 after 3 or 4 years that have lost the reds. Now, you can get the spare parts, you can fix them. I tend to not do it too much because there's not really much point buying the new RGBW boards and sticking them on, because you're going to get different colours and they're not going to match. They're going to be different. So the idea of always buying more than you need is a solid one here. So if you buy 8 wash lights, you get down to 6, it's probably still usable. Below 6, well, 4 might be a limit. Then buy some more. In the summer theatre that we look after, the lights are left there pretty well all year round. It's cold, it's wet, it's damp. It's not a nice environment, and they pretty well do okay. Some of the lights are rusty inside. Some of the steel components, typically small brackets and things like that, instead of being made out of aluminium, will be made out of steel, and they corrode fairly badly. I don't think they were particularly brilliant steel when they were new, but after a few years they're almost certainly going to be rusty. It's not a major problem, but if you want to keep these things going and you want to keep them in pristine condition, you will have to take them apart fairly often, clean them, re-lubricate some of the things like the zooms, but it's doable. And being honest, some of these can now be got for, you know, between £100 and £200 for something that's really quite nice. They do all of the common types, so you'll get the wash lights of this kind. I mean, they're 3 watt LEDs. These ones are red, green, blue and white. You can also get some that have got a UV and an amber in there. All of these lights have got quite limited shelf lives. As we said, they're made in fairly small batches by quite small companies, and the names that are stuck on the side are fairly random, really. I mean, some of them have just got the most bizarre names, but if you buy 10, the chances are they might even put your own name on the side if you want them to. I've never really been too interested in the actual branding because it doesn't exist. I mean, there has never been a factory with some of these makes on them. I mean, they're just random names for these small businesses, so they don't really exist. The downside to that is that there are literally thousands now of what appear to be different lights, and there's no common way of working out which one is which. So you could have identical lights that work totally differently because their DMX attributes are in a different order, do different things, and things like some of the effects programming will be unique to that particular one. 3 months later, it's replaced by something totally different. It's got a new brand, it's got a new model number. So you can't do what you can with the European and American lights. You look at a model number, you can look it up, and even in 10 years' time, you'll find the information out and you'll be able to write yourself a head file. I've been a CamSys Magic Q user for a long time, and I don't profess to be an expert, but I can make it do most of the things that I want it to. Now, one of the snags with controllers is that if you buy them off the shelf, they are not going to be able to talk to this vast array of Chinese lights that have a shelf life of perhaps 6 months before they're replaced with a different version. So you need to make sure if you buy a control, you buy one that you can program yourself. Now, I don't mean program as in sort of lights up, lights down, left and right. I mean, how does your lighting control talk to these lights? While I was setting up for this video this morning, It took me nearly 10 minutes to find the right head file for one of these lights, because I had to write it myself. It didn't exist sort of off the shelf, so I wrote one 2 years ago. And this lighting control has had so many shows through it that the head file that I wrote 2 years ago, I don't even know what it was. So eventually I found it, and very conveniently I'd actually labelled it with 2020 version. So in the end, I found it. The manuals for these things tend to be 2 or 3 pages, no information apart from the DMX attribute list. And that's your key feature. As long as you've got a list of which DMX channel does which function, you can build in practically any decent lighting controller now a file that will let the controller know how to work it. On the Magic Cue, for instance, if you actually push the button marked colour, you can push red and the lights will go red. Makes it nice and simple, but the controller needs to know how to do that. So unless you've actually got a bit of a handle on how DMX attributes convert into your lighting desk, you will be a bit stuck. If you went for a real brand name, so if you bought a particular Martin light, the chances are, if it's a reasonably recent lighting desk and it's got all the updates applied, that will be in the list. You just can't expect that when you've bought a Chinese light off Aliexpress. If you look at the lights that are available on Aliexpress at the moment, you'll find they fall into 3 categories. The wash lights, which tend to be lots of clusters of LEDs. In this particular one, I think it's 36 and they're 3 watt LEDs. RGBW on this one, so any colours you like, and they are pretty bright. This particular one has also got a zoom function. Now, not all of them have the zoom function. They may look exactly the same. They're in the same housing, they've got the same front panel of LEDs, but they don't have the motor that moves the LEDs forward and backwards behind those little lenses. So they don't do zoom. Now, you need to look very carefully at the wording to make sure it is a zoom version if that's what you want. In this particular case, the zoom range goes from very wide to modestly wide. You're not going to get a small puddle of light in the middle of a stage with one of those. The other thing that people are very keen on nowadays are beam lights. Now, you've seen them all over the place, you've seen them on TV, you've seen them on stages. They're lights that have a very narrow angle, typically 2-3 degrees. So when they actually stick out their light, it's in a near parallel beam, it looks very bright, and if you've got haze in the air, you actually get these amazing beams that just fire out. With beam lights like that, you're actually not particularly interested in lighting something up the other end. What you really want people to see is the light in the air, hence why you need a hazer. So beam lights look good for the beams. Yeah, okay, let's work. I found these particular ones, and you can see on the front they actually are rotating lenses. So there's actually 7 lenses on this light. They don't all have to be the same colour, you can actually have them doing different colours, but it's 7 lenses, and with the zoom that comes in and out, you can get near parallel beams, but if you widen the beams, then they all shoot off at different angles. So it's got loads and loads of really useful effects. And if you actually put it on wide angle and spread the beams out, it's a pretty nice wash. So I bought a few of these just on a bit of a whim and discovered they were really nice. So I got a few more of them. But essentially you can use them as parallel beams, so you can see the beams in the air, or if you want to, you can widen them out and they're soft enough that they're pretty useful wash lights. The other type of moving light that you'll see are the ones that can project patterns. Essentially, it's a light source. In between the light source and the lens are moving gobos, small discs with patterns cut in them that will project crosses, circles, dots, break up images. and all those sort of things, which you can either have really sharp or you can actually have really soft. Most of those are not variable red, green, blue and white like these are. With here you can have any colour in the rainbow. So you can have the pinks, the slightly yellows, the ambers, all those things are in there. The ones that tend to project patterns inside the light are full up with that projection mechanism. And to get a nice sharp image from a gobo, you need one light source right in the middle. So the optics are a bit more important in those. And of course that means that to do red, blue and green mixing, you'd have to use variable colour wheels. And physically, there isn't the space inside those lights for them. So there'll be one disc with probably 7 or 8 colours on. So you can project the patterns. The patterns can rotate in many of them, not all. Some of them might have 2 gobo discs, one with fixed gobos, one with gobos that can rotate, and you can either have one or the other, or you can have a balance of the two. One is usually sharper focused than the other. Because they're physically different inside the case, it's very difficult to make 2 gobos, even when they're close together, both be sharp. So the usual thing is one of the patterns will be sharp, the other will be more blurred, and you can choose which it is or have a halfway between the two. But the inside of those lights is pretty packed. So a colour wheel is probably going to take up valuable space. If you stick a colour wheel in, you then probably won't get a diffuser. So you're not going to be able to do washes with them. If you have no diffuser, you might have space for a wheel with something else on it. Maybe breakup prisms, which create typically 3 or 5 different versions of the one beam. So one gobo becomes 3. And so you have a few of those in the stage. That can be a nice effect. But that's the snag. There's a physical amount of space inside the light, and they fill it with whatever they think is useful. There are about 3 or 4 very common housings for these if you look in the adverts. What's inside could be totally different. So that gives you a bit of a clue as to what's going on with these Chinese lights. Realistically, I honestly don't think you should worry about reliability. The basics now are so established over there that the power supplies are pretty decent. The LEDs, even though I've said there's a tendency for the reds to go, it happens when you've used them for a long time. They do die. In a lot of cases the LEDs are actually okay, but the driver for them fails because it's working quite hard. And with most of these lights, what kills them is heat. Getting rid of the heat is important, hence why the noise these things make. The fans are working quite hard to keep the inside temperature down. And they're light sources and they're bright and they do get hot. Now, they're going to be sucking in as much air as they're blowing out. And if you are using haze, especially the oilier based hazes, I mean some of them tend nowadays to be quite light haze and they're not particularly tacky and sticky, but some people are still using hazers and smoke machines that are oil based, and when that stuff lands on the inside of your lights, it's like a magnet to dust. It blocks up the vents, the air flow through the light isn't so much, the temperature inside goes higher and things start to fail. That's not really the fault of the lights. I don't think it's fair to say that Chinese lights are unreliable. It's just that we use them and we never bother to clean the damn things. So we end up with lights that are failing through our lack of care and maintenance. These things have been up in the air for a couple of years and haven't had a clean in all that time. I don't think it's really fair to blame them, is it? It's my fault for not taking them down more regularly and giving things a good sort of hoover out and getting rid of all that dust and nasty stuff. That's my fault. There we go. A quick walk through moving lights and the sort of things you should watch out for when you're buying them on Aliexpress. I'll put up some images of the type of lights that I've personally got that I can say have done me pretty well. One warning about buying lights on the Aliexpress website. Don't forget to look very carefully at the page. Sometimes you'll see a price and there are two small icons. The price, if it's cheap, will probably be a different model, maybe even a different model from the title at the top. So it might say, in the case of this one, 36 3-watt LED RGBW wash light. You see a price and you think that's really good. Click on the little icon and you'll discover that that particular price doesn't relate to 36 3-watt LEDs. It relates to an 18 LED version, so it's dimmer. If you click on the other little icon, you'll see a picture of, say, that light, and the price has gone up to $50, $100 more. So you need to be quite aware. You'll see some of the comments sometimes where people say, I didn't get what I ordered. But in most cases, I've discovered it's because you clicked on the wrong thing. The title is always the best one. The little icons switch you from maybe 2 or 3 different versions of the same product. It's very easy to make a mistake like that. But even those small dim ones are usually pretty decent. It's just that it's not what you're expecting. So just take a bit of care with that. Maybe now you know a little bit more about how buying LED lighting from China works. Have a good look on Aliexpress, because there's some cracking gear on there. You've just got to filter away the rubbish that surrounds it. Once you've done that, you can get some really good lights. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Look after yourselves and take care.